I call this fourth strategy the high ground. It is a variant of the shield wall strategy that I talked about in a previous video. It appeals to bigger rosters where people tend to have multiple counters to each team, but I think there are many learnings for smaller rosters too, especially when it comes to maps with fleets, so don't tune out just yet. The idea behind this strategy is that you need to get your opponent to spend some of their counters in a front zone that they may need in the back zone behind that. This strategy is not some kind of trap where you're trying to fool your opponent, as a somewhat intelligent opponent will know exactly what you are doing. But even if they do know, it doesn't change the outcome. The outcome is that your opponent needs to make a difficult decision in the front zone. You have to set one or two teams there with multiple possible counter options, some of which are not ideal. Now, if your opponent tries to keep their ideal counter for the back because they know they're going to need it for the team behind, then they may lose banners in the front wall by going in too light. Or perhaps they'll even lose the fight and need a second attempt to take out your team. Now, this cleanup can be tricky to choose as they may not know what is in the back yet and won't know which teams they can best use to clean up as they don't know what they can miss out on. Now, the strength of this strategy lies in forcing your opponent to make decisions in the front without enough of the information, which creates the possibility for mistakes. Now, by the time they reach the back, you should have the infamous high ground advantage, where you put yourself into a superior position and it becomes super difficult for your opponent to win. The requirements for this strategy are, first off, smart relic allocation. You need to have relics on specific characters that push your opponent to use a stronger counter than their usual preferred options, if they don't have the relics to answer your team. Now, at my GP range, for example, many people will have a relic spy for GOTB, but very few people have a relic scion. So getting a high relic spy is a super easy way to force your opponent to use a stronger counter than Treya up against your Geonosians. If they then need this stronger counter in the back wall, they can't clear it anymore or they'll be very inefficient. So notice what I'm saying here. The point isn't to add a bunch of relics to any specific team to make it tougher to beat. It is to identify one specific character in a few defensive teams and use that to your advantage. Now, usually this character is a very high damage dealer that may one-shot important characters on the other team. Sometimes it's a tank that you just can't burn through with certain soft counters. The second requirement is that you need high flexibility on offense and counters to almost everything. If your opponent sets many of their meta teams in their front walls, so essentially using the shield wall strategy against you, and you can't break through both of them, then you may lose the match as they will probably clear around 3 zones, 2 of your weaker front zones and then 1 zone in the back. While you may only be getting through 2 of their zones, 1 of their stronger ones in the front and a weaker one in the back. And maybe you'll pick off 1 team in the other front wall, but it won't be enough. So in other words, with the offense that you keep, you must be able to beat almost any combination of their strongest teams in order for this strategy to work. And sometimes that comes down to modding. To give you an example, a fast Padme can usually handle both a Darth Revan and a General Skywalker team. But a slow Padme can't handle General Skywalker. Therefore, you only have one choice in your Padme modding: she needs to be fast. You need to identify all of these situations for your roster so you can beat your opponent no matter what they end up setting on defense. Now, if you prepare well for offense and can handle your opponent's top teams while still having a strong backwall, then you should be just fine. Now, what you do with the map for this strategy is very important. As you can imagine, it's more effective in Grand Arena formats without fleets, as there are more spots in the backwall to take advantage of. Your opponent will first have to beat 2 teams in the front to reveal 1 back zone with stronger teams, and then they have to beat another 2 teams for the other back zone. If they then fail against any team, either in the front or back zones, they may fall short with their cleanups. Now, in the case of the previous strategy, the shield wall, at least you know that if you manage to get through the front walls, you can usually get a full clear by scraping together teams and characters at the bottom of your usable roster against whatever is in the back. Now, if you have to go through this process in the front, however, you have no clue yet how many mistakes you can afford to make and which characters you can spare in cleanups if necessary. If it's a map that does have fleets, then you want to put the kinds of non-meta teams in the bottom front zone that your opponent likely won't have a straightforward counter against when using this strategy. It's a zone where you want to force them into a choice they may not be happy about. It's difficult to give you something concrete here, as teams and their counters constantly evolve as the game progresses, but think about teams that have a bunch of different counters, none of which are necessarily ideal. You can make your opponent's choice even more difficult if your opponent tends to set certain teams on defense that would have done well against it on offense, or if they have invested a lot more relics into a certain counter team that they wouldn't want to use against yours in the front wall, as it would be overkill and thus risky for whatever they might face in the back. Now, if you use this strategy on a map with fleets, it's important that the other front zone, the one in front of the fleet zone, contains defensive teams that your opponent expects from you on defense. A lot of people love setting Grievous on defense, for example, but if your opponent doesn't see that team in either front wall, then you've likely revealed one of your teams in the back wall without them even opening it yet. That defeats the purpose of this strategy, because then they will only have to guess one team in the back, and that may not be too difficult for them. You want to keep them guessing whether you went light on defense in the back, or if you have something strong waiting in the back. So you can imagine if you could fool someone into thinking you have a strong back zone and they go very light in the front, but then you actually kept those strong teams in the back there for offense to score very high banners with, that would be another way of fooling someone with this strategy. So you have quite a lot of flexibility there. Now, speaking of Grievous, he could actually be the tricky team that I referred to for you in the front zone in some situations. If your opponent doesn't have a Jedi counter that matches your Grievous' strength right now, and they never use certain soft counters, then they would need to use something stronger and would have to use their Jedi Knight Revan against another team of yours, or maybe set it on defense. Now you might be thinking, but Grievous is my strongest defensive team today, because you like to keep everything else for offense as many other people do. Now remember that this won't be true for big rosters, and that more counters emerge over time. Also, much like the shield wall strategy, this is a heavy defensive strategy. It's expecting you to put a lot of your strongest teams on defense. Though you can aim for a little bit more balance in this case, because the goal isn't to stop your opponent from full clearing necessarily. It's just to force them into situations where they start losing a bunch of banners. Like I said before, it's this small uncertainty that you create with a tricky team in the front, which opens up the possibility to score higher banners than them. That's what this strategy is about. Because your opponent would either go too light in the front and lose a bunch of banners there, so instead of getting 60 they might end up with 55, or they might risk not clearing the back by going too heavy in the front. Now some of you may think that all of this sounds great and stuff, but you like your heavy offense strategies and you like full clearing. So how do you even get started with using a strategy like this, which is so radically different from what you've used so far? Now I agree, it's not easy to get to the point where you can start using defensive strategies like this. But imagine how uncomfortable it must be for your opponent to have no clue yet what strength of teams they might expect in the back, and imagine how much power it gives you over the outcome of the match. Instead of immediately switching over to a defensive strategy like this, you could slowly build up how defensive you are. You can start by setting more strong defensive teams in the front wall, and over time begin shifting them to the back one by one. It's basically a move along the spectrum from more offensive towards more defensive, and it might help you to find the kind of balance that you feel best about, that also gives you great results in terms of scores. Now one more tip I want to give you is that if you use this strategy, it helps to be the last to attack, or your opponent may be able to derive which teams you use to beat theirs, and they will have more information beforehand on what you might have in the back. Now of course this is the case for almost any strategy. You always have a little bit of an advantage if you attack later, but if you don't think that the knowledge will affect the outcome too much, then just go ahead and attack whenever. I'm personally really not interested in waiting for opponents to attack, because once you commit to a certain strategy you should just follow through and set a good score. But sometimes it may help you if you have a really tough matchup. Now in conclusion, this is a widely used strategy at high GP that can give you a lot of control over the match. But if you're not ready to handle anything your opponent sets on defense, then it's also a really easy way to lose, as you might only end up clearing 2 zones. Now have you ever used this strategy in Grand Arena? Have you ever heard of it before? It may seem far too risky for some people putting some of your strongest stuff in the back, but I've seen plenty of skilled players use this with a lot of success. The next strategy is my favorite and most used one. It's all about anticipating what your opponent will do and countering that specifically. See you there.